The roots of discontent. The foremost reason that happiness is so hard to achieve is that the was not designed with the comfort of human beings in mind. It is almost immeasurably huge, and most of it is hostilely empty and cold. It is a setting for great violence, as when occasionally a star explodes, turning ashes everything within billions of miles. The rare planet whose gravity field would not crush our bones is probably swimming in lethal gases. Even planet Earth, which is so idyllic and picturesque, is not to be taken for granted. To survive on it, men and women have had to struggle for millions of years against ice, fire, floods, wild animals, and invisible microorganisms that appear out of nowhere to snuff us out. It seems that every time a pressing danger is avoided, a new and more sophisticated threat appears on the horizon. No sooner do we invent new substance, that is by products, start poisoning the environment. Throughout history, weapons that were designed to provide security have turned around and threatened to destroy their makers. As some diseases are curbed, new ones become virulent, and it for a while mortality is reduced, then overpopulation starts to haunt us. The four grim horsemen of the apocalypse are never very far away. The earth may be our only home, but it is a home full of booby traps waiting to go off at any moment. It is not that the universe is a random in abstract mathematical sense. The motions of the stars, the transformation of energy that occur in it, might be predicted and explained well enough. But natural processes do not take human desires into account. They are deaf and blind to our needs, and thus they are random in contrast with the order we attempt to establish through our goals. A meteorological collision course with New York City might be obeying all the laws of the universe, but it would still be damn nuisance. A virus that attacks the cells of Mozart is only doing what comes naturally, even though it inflicts a grave loss of humankind. The universe is not hostile, yet it is friendly. The words of J. H. Holmes. It's simply insufficient. Chaos is one of the oldest concepts in myth and religion. It is rather foreign to the physical and biological sciences because in terms of these laws and the events in the cosmos are perfectly reasonable. For instance, chaos theory in the sciences attempts to describe regularities in what appears to be utterly random. But chaos can has a different meaning in psychology and other human sciences. Because in human goals and desires are taken if human goals and desires are taken as the starting point, there is irreconcilable disorder in the cosmos. There is not much that we as individuals can do to change the way the universe runs. In our lifetime, we exert little influence over the forces that interfere in our well being. It is important to do as much as we can do to prevent nuclear war, to abolish social injustice, to eradicate hunger and disease. But it is prudent not to expect that efforts to change the external conditions will immediately improve the quality of our lives. As G.S. Mills wrote, no great improvements in the lot of mankind is possible until a great change takes place in the fundamental constitution of their modes of thought. How we feel about ourselves, the joy we get from living, ultimately depend directly on how mind filters and interprets everyday experiences. Whether we are happy depends on our inner harmony, not on the controls we have are able to exert over great forces of the universe. Certainly, we should keep on learning how to master the external environment because our physical survival may depend on it, but such a mastery is not going to add a jot to how good we are as individuals feel or reduce the chaos in the world as we experience it. To do that, we must learn how to achieve mastery over consciousness itself. Each of us has a picture, however vague, of what we like to accomplish before we die. How close we are to get to attaining the goal becomes a measure of the quality of life we are living. If it remains beyond reach, we grow resentful or resigned. If it is the least in part achieved, we experience a sense of happiness and satisfaction. For a majority of people on this earth, life goals are simple: to survive, to leave children who will in turn survive, if possible, to do so within a certain amount of comfort and dignity. In the favelas spreading around the South American cities, in the drought-stricken regions of Africa, among the millions of Asians who have to solve problem of hunger day after day, there is not much else to hope for. But as soon as these basic problems of survival are solved, merely having enough food and comfortable shelter is no longer sufficient to make people content. New needs are felt, new desires arise. With affluence and power come escalating expectations, and as our level of wealth and comfort keeps increasing, the sense of well-being that we hope for to achieve keeps receding into a distance. When Cyrus the Great had 10,000 cooks prepare new dishes for his table, the rest of the Persia had barely enough to eat. These days, every household in the first world has access to recipes of the most diverse land and can duplicate the feast of the past emperors. But does this make us feel more satisfied? This paradox of rising expectations suggests that improving the quality of life might be an insurmountable task. In fact, there is no inherent problem in our desire to escalate our goals. As long as we enjoy the struggle along the way, the problem arises when people are so fixated on what they want to achieve that they cease to derive pleasure from the present. When that happens, they forfeit their chance of contentment. Though evidence suggests that most of the people are caught up in the frustrating treadmill of rising expectations, many individuals have found ways to escape it. These are people who, regardless of their material conditions, have been able to improve the quality of their lives. We are satisfied and who have a way of making those around them also a bit more happy. Such individuals lead vigorous lives and are open to variety of experiences, keep on learning until the day they die, and have strong lives and commitments to other people and to the environment in which they live. They enjoy whatever they do, even if tedious and difficult. They hardly ever get bored and they can take in stride everything that comes their way. Perhaps their greatest strength is that they are in control of their lives. We shall see later how they have managed to reach that state. But before we do so, we need to review some of the devices that have developed over time as protection against the threat of chaos and the reasons why such external defenses often do not work. The shields of culture. Over the course of human evolution, as each group of people become gradually aware of the enormity of its isolation in the cosmos and of the precariousness of its hold on survival, it developed myths and beliefs to transform the random crushing forces of the universe into manageable or by at least understandable patterns. One of the major functions of every culture has been to shield its members from chaos, to reassure them of their importance and ultimate success. The Eskimo, hunter of the Amazon basin, the Chinese, the Navajo, the Australian Aborigine, the New Yorker, all have taken for granted that they live in the center of the universe and that they are and have special dispensation that puts them on the fast track to the future. Without such trust in exclusive privileges, it would be difficult to face odds of existence. This is as it should be, but there are times when the feeling that one has found safety in the bosom of a friendly cosmos becomes dangerous. An unrealistic trust in the shields, in the cultural myths, can lead to equally extreme delusional disillusion as when they fail. This tends to happen whenever a culture has had to run a good luck for for a while seems indeed to have found a way of controlling the forces of nature. At the point of it is At that point it is logical for it to begin believing that it is chosen people who need no longer fear a major setback. The Romans reached that juncture several centuries ruling the Mediterranean. The Chinese were confident of their immutable superiority before the Mongol quest, and the Aztecs before the arrival of the Spaniards. The cultural hubris of or overweening presumption about what we are entitled to from a universe that is basically insensitive to human needs generally leads to trouble. The unwarranted sense of security sooner or later results in a rude awakening. When people start believing that progress is inevitable and life easy, they may quickly lose courage and determination in the face of the first signs of adversity. As they realize that what they had believed in is not entirely true, they abandon faith in everything else they have learned. Deprived of the customary supports that cultural values had given them, they flounder on a morass of anxiety and apathy. Such symptoms of dissolution are not hard to observe around us now. The most obvious ones relate to the pervasive listlessness that affects so many lives. Genuinely happy individuals are few and far between. How many people do you know who enjoy what they are doing, who are reasonably satisfied with their lot, who do not regret the past and look to the future for with genuine confidence? If Diogenes with his lantern 23 centuries ago had difficulty finding an honest man, today he would have perhaps an even more troublesome tune finding a happy one. This great general malaise is not due directly to external causes. The general malaise is not due directly to external causes. Unlike so many other nations in the contemporary world, we can't blame our problems on a harsh environment, on widespread poverty, or on an operation of a foreign occupying army. The roots of discontent are internal, and each person must untangle them personally with his or her own power. The shields that have worked in the past, the order that religion, patriotism, ethnic traditions, and habits instilled by social classes used to provide, are no longer effective for increasing numbers of people who feel exposed to harsh winds of chaos. The lack of inner order manifests itself in the subjective condition that some call ontological anxiety or existential dread. Basically, it is the fear of being a feeling that is there is no meaning to life and that existence is not worth going on with. Nothing seems to make sense. In the last few generations, the specter of nuclear war was added, an unprecedented threat to our hopes. There no longer seems to be any point to the historical strivings of humankind. We are just forgotten specks drifting in the void. With each passing year, the chaos of the physical universe becomes magnified in the minds of the multitude. As people move through life, passing from hopeful ignorance of youth into sobering adulthood, they sooner or later face increasingly nagging question. Is this all there is? Childhood can be painful, adolescence confusing, but for most people behind it all, there is an expectation that after one grows up, things will get better. During the years of early adulthood, the future still looks promising. The hope remains that one's goals will be realized. But inevitably, the bathroom mirror shows the first white hairs and confirms the fact that those extra pounds are not about to leave. Inevitably, eyesight begins to fail and mysterious pains begin to shoot through the body, like waiters in a restaurant starting to place breakfast, setting on surrounding tables while one is still having dinner. These these intimations of mortality plainly communicate the message. Your time is up. It's time for you to move on. When this happens, few people are ready. Wait a minute, can't this be happening to me? Why, I haven't even begun to live. Where's all the money I was supposed to have made? Where are all the good times I was going to have? A feeling of having been led on, being cheated, is understandable consequence of this realization. From the earliest years, we have been conditioned to believe that a benign fate that would provide for us. After all, everybody seems to agree that we have had a great fortune of living in the richest country that ever was, in the most scientifically advanced period of human history, surrounded by the most efficient technology, protected by the wisest constitution. Therefore, it made sense to expect that we would have richer, more meaningful life than any other members of the human race. If our grandparents living in that ridiculously primitive past would could be content, just imagine how happy we would be. Scientists told us that this was so. It was preached from pulpits of churches, and it was confirmed by thousands of TV commercials celebrating the good life. Yet, despite all these assurances, sooner or later we wake up alone, sensing that there is no way this affluent, scientific, and sophisticated world is going to provide us with happiness. As this realization slowly sets in, different people react to it differently. Some try to ignore it and renew their efforts to acquire more of the things that we are supposed to make life good: bigger cars and homes, more power on the job, more glamorous lifestyle. They renew their efforts, determined still to achieve satisfaction that up until then has eluded them. Sometimes this solution works simply because one is drawn into competitive struggle, that there is no time to realize that the goal is not come any nearer. But if a person does take the time out of reflect, disillusionment returns. After each success, it becomes clearer that money, power, status, and possessions do not by themselves necessarily add an iota to the quality of life. Others decide to attack directly the threatening symptoms. If it is a body going to seed that rings the first alarm, they will go on diets, join health clubs, do aerobics, but buy a Nautilus or undergo plastic surgery. If the problem seems to be that nobody pays much attention, then buy books on how to get power and how to make friends, or they enroll in assertiveness training courses and have power lunches. After a while, however, it becomes obvious that these piecemeal solutions won't work either. No matter how much energy you devote to its care, the body will eventually give out. If we are learning to be more assertive, we might inadvertently alienate our friends. And if we devote too much time cultivating new friends, we might threaten relationships with our spouse and family. There are just so many dams about to burst and so little time to tend to all of them. Daunted by the futility of trying to keep up with the demands that cannot possibly be met, some will just surrender and retire gracefully into relative oblivion. Following candidates' advice, they will give up on their world and cultivate their little gardens. They might dabble into genteel forms to escape from the developing harmless hobby or accumulating collection of abstract paintings or porcelain figures, or they might lose themselves to alcohol or dream world of drugs, while exotic pleasures and expensive recreations temporarily take the mind off the basic question, is there all there is? Few claim to have ever found the answer that way. Traditionally, the problem of existence has been most directly confronted through religion. An increasing number of disillusioned are turning back to it, choosing either one, one of the standard creeds or more esoteric Eastern variety. But religions are only temporarily successful attempts to cope with the lack of the meaning in life. They are not permanent answers. At more moments of history, they have explained convincingly what was wrong about human existence and have given credible answers. From the 4th and the 8th century of our era, Christianity spread throughout Europe, Islam arose in the Middle East, and Buddhism acquired Asia. For hundreds of years, these religions provided satisfying goals for people to spread their lives pursuing. But today it is more difficult to accept their worldwide views as definitive. The form in which the religions have presented their truths, myths, revelations, holy texts, no longer compels belief in the era of scientific rationality, even though the substance of the truths may have remained unchanged. A vital new religion may one day arise again. In the meantime, those who seek consolation in existing churches often pay for their peace of mind with tacit agreement to ignore the deal of what is known about the way the world works. The, the evidence that none of these solutions are any longer very effective is irrefutable. In the heyday of its material splendor, our society is suffering from an astonishingly variety of strange ills. The profits made from widespread dependence on illicit drugs and enriching murders and terrorists. It seems possible that in the near future we shall be ruled by an oligarchy of former drug dealers who are rapidly gaining wealth and power at the expense of law-abiding citizens, and in our sexual lives, by shedding the shackles of hypocritical morality, we have unleashed destructive viruses upon one another. The trends are often so disturbing that we tend to become jaded and tune out whatever we hear the latest statistics. But the ostrich strategy for avoiding bad news is hardly productive. Better to face facts and take care of to avoid becoming one of the statistics. There are figures that may be reassuring for some. For instance, in the past 30 years, we have doubled our per capita use of energy. Most of it thanks to fivefold increase in the electric utilities and appliances. Other trends, however, would reassure no one. In 1984, there were still 34 million people in the United States who lived below the poverty line, defined as yearly income of 10,609 or less for a family of four. A number has changed a little in generations. In the United States, per capita frequency of violent crimes, murder, rape, robbery, assault increased by well over 300% between 1960 and 1986. As a result, in 1978, 1,085,500 such crimes were reported, and by 1986 the number had climbed to 1,488,140. The murder rate held a steady at about 100,000% above that in other industrial countries like Canada, Norway, France in roughly the same period. The rate of divorce rose by 400% from 31 to 1000 per 1000 married couples in 1950 to 121 in 1984. During those 25 years, venereal disease also tripled, and in 1960 there were 259,000 cases of gonorrhea. By 1984 there were almost 900,000. We still have no clear idea that the tragic price that latest scourge, the AIDS epidemic, will claim before it's over. The three to fourfold increase social pathology over the last generation holds true in the astonishingly number of areas. For instance, in 1955, there were 1,700,000 instances of clinical intervention involving mental patients across the country. In 1975, the number had climbed to 6,400,000. Perhaps not coincidentally, similar figures illustrate the increase in the national paranoia. During the decade of 1975 to 1985, the budget authorized by the Department of Defense climbed from 87.9 billion a year to 284.7 billion, more than threefold increase. It is true that the budget of Department of Education also tripled in the same period. But in 1985, this amounted to 17.4 billion, at least as far as the allocation of resources is concerned. The sword is about 16 times mightier than the pen. The future does not look much rosier. Today's teenagers show symptoms of malaise that ails their elders, sometimes in even more virulent form. Fewer young people now grow up in families where both parents are present to share responsibilities involved in bringing up children. In 1960, 1 in 10 adolescents were living in one parent family. In 1980, the proportion had doubled, and in 1990, it is expected to triple. In 1982, there were 800,000 juveniles, average age 15 years, committed to various jails. These statistics on drug use, venereal disease, disappearance from home, and unwed pregnancy are all grim, yet probably quite short of the mark. Between 1950 and 1980, teenage suicides increased by about 300%, especially among the young men from more affluent classes. Of 29,250 suicides reported in 1985, 1,339 were white boys in the ages of 15 to 19. 4 times fewer than white girls of the same age killed themselves. 10 times fewer black boys, young blacks. However, more than catch up in the number of deaths from homicide. Last but not least, the level of knowledge in the population seems to be declining every year, everywhere. For instance, every average math score in the SAT test was 466 in 1967. In 1984, it was 426. Similar decrease was noted in verbal scores. In the Diger-like statistics could go on and on. Why is that? Despite all achieved previously undreamed of miracles of progress, we seem more helpless in facing life than our less privileged ancestors. The answer seems clear. While humankind collectively has increased the material powers a thousandfold, it has not advanced very far in terms of improving content and experience. Reclaiming experience. There is no way out of this predicament except for the individual to take things in hand personally. If values and institutions no longer provide a supportive framework as they once did, each person must use whatever tools are available to carve out a meaningful, enjoyable life. One of most important tools in the quest is provided by psychology. Up to now, the main contribution of this fledgling science has been to discover how past events shed light on previous present behavior. It has made us aware that adult irrationality is often the result of childhood frustrations. But is another way that the discipline of psychology can be put to use. It is helping to answer the question, given that we are who we are, with whatever hang-ups and repressions, what can we do to improve our future? To overcome the anxieties and depressions of contemporary life, individuals must become independent of the social environment to the degree that they no longer respond exclusively in terms of its rewards and punishments. To achieve such autonomy, a person has to lean to provide rewards to herself. Such she has to develop the ability to find enjoyment and purpose regardless of external circumstances. This challenge is both easier and more difficult than it sounds. Easier because the ability to do so is entirely within the person's hand. Difficult because it requires a discipline and perseverance that are relatively rare in any era, and perhaps especially in the present. And both, before all else, achieving control over experience requires drastic change in attitude about what is important and what is not. We grow up believing what counts most in our lives is that which will occur in the future. Parents teach children that it is they if they learn good habits now, they will be better off as adults. Teachers assure pupils that the boring classes will benefit them later, when the students are going to be looking for jobs. The company vice president tells junior employees that to have patience and to work hard, because one of these days they will get promoted to the executive ranks. At the end of the long struggle of advancement, the golden years of retirement beckon. We are always getting to live, as Ralph Waldo Emerson used to say, but never a living. For as poor Francis learned in the children's story, it is always bread and jam tomorrow, never bread and jam today. Of course, this emphasis on the postponement of gratification is to a certain extent inevitable, as and many others before and after him have noted. Civilization is built on the repression of individual desires. It would be impossible to maintain any kind of social order, any complex division of labor, unless society's members were forced to take on the habits and skills that confined culture required, whether the individual liked it or not. Socialization, or the transformation of human organism into a person who functions successfully within a particular social system, cannot be avoided. The essence of socialization is to make people dependent on social controls, to have them respond predictably to reward and punishment, and most effective form of socialization is achieved when people identify so thoroughly with the social order that they no longer can imagine themselves breaking any of its rules. In making us work for its goals, society has assisted by some powerful allies, our biological needs and our genetic conditioning. All social controls, for instance, are ultimately based on a threat to the survival instinct. The people or an opposed country obey their conquerors because they want to go on living. Until very recently, laws of even and most civilized nations, such as Great Britain, were enforced by threats of caning, whipping, mutilation, and death. When they do not rely on pains, social systems use pleasure to induce to accept norms. The good life promised as a reward of a life for a lifetime of work and the adherence to laws is built on the cravings contained in our genetic programs. Practically every desire that has become a human nature, from sexuality to aggression, from a longing for security to receptivity to change, has been exploited as a source of social control by politicians, churches, corporations, and advertisers. To lure recruits into the Turkish armed forces, the sultans in the 16th century promised conscripts the rewards of raping women in the conquered countries. Nowadays, the posters promise young men when they join the army, they will see the world. It is important to realize that seeking a pleasure is a reflex response built into our genes and the preservation of the species, not for the purpose of our own personal advantage. The pleasure we take in eating is an efficient way to ensure that our body will get the nourishment it needs. The pleasure of sexual intercourse is equaled practical method for the genes to program the body to reproduce and thereby to ensure the continuity of the genes. When a man is physically attracted to a woman or vice versa, he usually imagines, assuming that he thinks about it all, that this is a desire, is an expression of its own individual interest, a result by its own intentions. In reality, more often than not, his interest is simply being manipulated by the invisible genetic code. Following its own plans. As long as the attraction is a reflex based on purely physical reactions, the person's own conscious plans probably play only a minimum role. There is nothing wrong with following the genetic programming and relishing and resulting pressures it provides, as long as you recognize them for what they are, and as long as we retain some control over them when it is necessary to pursue other goals to which we might decide to assign priority. The problem is that it has recently become fashionable to regard whatever we feel inside as true voice of nature speaking. The only authority many people trust today is instinct. If something feels good, it is natural and spontaneous, but it must be right. But when we follow the suggestions of genetic and social instructions without questions, we relinquish the control of consciousness and become helpless playthings and imperfect forces. The person who cannot resist food or alcohol or whose mind is constantly focused on sex is not free to direct his or her psychic energy. The liberated view of human nature, which accepts and endorses every instinct or drive we happen to make or to have simply because it's there, results in consequences that are quite reactionary. Much of contemporary realism turns out to be just a variation of good old-fashioned fatalism. People feel relieved of responsibility by recourse to the concept of nature by nature. However, we are born ignorant. Therefore, should we not try to learn? Some people produce more than the usual amount of androgens and therefore become excessively aggressive. Does that mean that they should freely express violence? We cannot deny the facts of nature, but we should certainly try to improve them. Submission to genetic programming can be quite dangerous because it leaves us helpless. A person cannot override genetic instructions when necessary, is awake and always vulnerable. Instead of deciding how to act in terms of potential personal goals, he has to surrender to his things that his body has been programmed to do. One must per- particularly achieve control over instinctual drives to achieve high dependency of society. For as long as we respond predictably to what feels good and what feels bad, it is easy for others to exploit our preferences for their own ends. A thoroughly socialized person is one who desires only the rewards that others around him have agreed to he should long for, rewards often grafted onto genetically programmed desires. He may encounter thousands of potentially fulfilling experiences, but he fails to notice them because they are not the things of he desires. What matters is not what he has now, but what he might obtain if he does as others want. Caught in the treadmill of social control, that person keeps reaching for a prize that always dissolves in his hands. In a complex society, many powerful groups are involved in socializing sometimes to seemingly contradictory goals. On the one hand, official institutions like schools, churches, banks try to turn us into responsible citizens willing to work hard and save. On the other hand, we constantly are cajoled by merchants, manufacturers, and advertisers to spend our earnings on products that will produce the most profits for them. And finally, the underground system of forbidden pleasures run by gamblers, pimps, and drug dealers, which is dialectically linked to the official institutions, promises its own rewards of easy dissipation provided we pay. The messages are very different, but their outcome is essentially the same. They make us dependent on the social system that exploits our energies for their own purpose. There is no question that to survive, and especially to survive in a complex society, it is necessary to work for external goals and to postpone immediate gratification. But a person does not have to be turned into a puppet jerked about by social controls. The solution is to gradually become free of societal rewards and learn how to substitute them rewards that are under one's own powers. This is not to say that we should abandon every goal endorsement by society. Rather, it means that in addition to or instead of the goals others used to bribe us with, we develop a set of our own. The most important step in emancipating oneself from the social controls is the ability to find rewards in the events of each moment. The person learns to enjoy and finds meaning in the ongoing stream of experience, in the process of living itself. The burden of social controls automatically falls from one's own shoulders. The power returns to the person when rewards are no longer relegated to the outside forces. It is no longer necessary to struggle for goals that always seem to recede into the future. To end each boring day with a hope that tomorrow perhaps something good will happen. Instead of forever straining for the tantalizing prize dangled just out of reach, one begins to harvest the genuine rewards of living. It is not by abandoning ourselves to instinctual desires that we become free of societal controls. We must become independent from what dictates the body, and learn to take charge of what happens in the mind. Pain and pleasure occur in consciousness and exist only there. As long as we obey the socially continued stimulus response pattern that exploit our biological inclinations, we are controlled from the outside. To the extent that the glamorous ad makes us salivate for the product sold, uh, or that frown from the boy spoils the day. We are not free to determine the content of experience, since we experience what we experience is reality. As far as we are concerned, we can transform reality to the extent that we influence what happens in consciousness and thus free ourselves from the threat of blandishments of the outside world. Men are not afraid of things, but how they view them, said Epictetus a long time ago, and great Emperor Marcus Aurelius wrote, "If you are pained by external things, it is not that they disturb you, but your own judgment of them. It is your own power to wipe the judgment now." Paths of liberation. The simple truth that the control of consciousness determines the quality of life. It has been known for a long time, in fact, for as long as humanity records exist. Oracle's advice in ancient Delphi, "Know thyself," implied it. It was clearly recognized by Aristotle, whose notion of the virtuous activity of the soul in many ways prefigures the argument of this book. And it was developed by the Stoic philosophers in classic antiquity. The Christian monastic orders perfected various methods for learning how to channel thoughts and desires. Ignatius of Loyola rationalized them in these famous spiritual exercises. The last great attempt to free consciousness from domination of impulses and social controls was psychoanalysis by Freud, and who pointed out the two tyrants who fought over control over mind were id and the superego, the first servant of the genes and the second lackey of the society. The both representing the other opposed them was the ego, which stood in of the genuine needs of the self connected to its concrete environment. But the East techniques for achieving control over consciousness proliferated and achieved levels of enormous sophistication. Although quite different from one another in many respects, the yogi disciplines of India, the Taoist approach to life developed in China, and the Zen varieties of Buddhist all seek free consciousness from the deterministic influences of outside forces, be the biological or social in nature. Thus, for instance, a yogi disciplines his mind to ignore pain than ordinary people would have no choice but to let into their awareness. Similarly, he can ignore insistent claims of hunger or sexual arousal that most of the peoples would be helpless to resist. The same effect can be achieved in different ways, either through perfecting severe mental discipline as in yoga, through cultivating constant spontaneity as in Zen. But the intended result is identical: to free the inner life from the threat of chaos on one hand and the rigid conditioning of the biological urges on the other, and hence we become independent from the social controls that exploit both. But if it is true that people have known for thousands of years what it takes to become free and in control of one's life, Why haven't we made more progress in that direction? Why are we helpless or more so than our ancestors were facing the chaos that interferes with happiness? There are at least two good explanations for this failure. In the first place, the kind of knowledge or wisdom one needs emancipating consciousness is not cumulative. It cannot be condensed into a formula. It cannot be memorized and then routinely applied. Like other complex forms of expertise, such mature political judgment or refined aesthetic sense, it must be earned through trial and error experience by each individual generation after generation. Control over consciousness is not simply cognitive skill, at least as much as intelligence. It requires the commitment of emotions and will. It is not enough to know how to do it. One must do it consistently in the same way as athletes, musicians who must keep practicing what they know in theory. And this is never easy. Progress is relatively last in fields that apply knowledge to the material world, such as physics and genetics. But it is painfully slow when knowledge is applied to modify our own habits and desires. Second, the knowledge on how to control consciousness must be formulated every time the cultural context changes. The wisdom of mystics, of the Sufi, or the great yogis, or the Zen masters might have been excellent in their own time and might still be the best if we lived in those times and those cultures. But when transplanted to contemporary California, those systems lose quite a bit of their original power. They contain elements that are specific to the original context, and when these accidental components are not distinguished from what is essential, the path to freedom gets overgrown by brambles of meaningless mumbo jumbo. Ritual form wins over substance, and seeker is back where he started. Control over consciousness cannot be institutionalized. As soon as it becomes part of a set of social rules and norms, it ceases to be effective in the way it was originally intended to be. Romant, Routinization, unfortunately, tends to take place very rapidly. Freud is still alive, was still alive when his quest for liberating the ego from his oppressors was turned into a staid ideology and rigidly regulated profession. Marx was even less fortunate. His attempts to free consciousness from tyranny of economic exploitation were soon turned into a system of repression that would have bogged the poor founder's mind. If Christ returned to preach his message of liberation in the Middle Ages, he would have been crucified again and again by the leaders of the very church whose worldly powers was built on his name. In each new epoch, perhaps every generation or every few years, if the conditions in which we live change rapidly, it becomes necessary to think and reformulate what it takes to establish autonomy in consciousness. Early Christianity helped the masses free themselves from power of the ossified imperial regime and from an ideology that could give meaning only to the lives of the rich and the powerful, and could give meaning only to the lives. The Reformation liberated great numbers of people from their political and ideological exploitation of the Roman Church. The philosophies and later statesmen who drafted enacted the American Constitution resisted the controls established by kings, popes, and aristocracy. When inhuman conditions of factory labor became obvious obstacles to the workers' freedom in order to their own experience, as they were in 19th century industrial Europe, Mars' message turned out to be especially relevant. The much more subtle and more equally coercive social controls of bourgeois Vienna m- made Freud's road out to liberation pertinent to those whose minds have been warped by such conditions. The insights of gospel of Martin Luther or of the farmers of the Constitution of Marx and Freud, just to mention and a very few of those attempts that have been made in the West to increase happiness by enhancing freedom will always be valid and useful, even though some of them have been perverted in their application, but they certainly do not exhaust either the problems or the solutions. Given the recurring need to return to the central question of how to achieve mastery over one's life, what does the present state of knowledge say about it? How can it help the person learn to rid himself of anxieties and fears and thus become free of the controls of society, whose rewards he can now take or leave? As suggested before, the way is through control over consciousness, which in turn leads to control over quality of experience. Any small gain in that direction will make life more rich, more enjoyable, more meaningful. Before starting to explore the ways in which to improve the quality of experience, it will be useful to review briefly how consciousness works and what it actually means to have experiences armed with knowledge one can more easily achieve personal liberation with. Thanks for listening. Please recommend to us what content you would like to watch on our channel. Thank you.